Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host today, Steve Francisco, and on this beautiful July summer day in Minnesota, we're really pleased to welcome a new guest to our studio today. Welcome to Michelle Kelm-Helgen, who is the chair of the newly created Minnesota Sports Authority, which is overseeing one of the biggest construction projects in the history of the state of Minnesota. Do I have that about right?
Yes, that's what I'm told.
So before we get into some discussion about the stadium, let's learn a little bit more about you, Michelle. Where did you grow up and where did you go to school?
I actually grew up in a small town, Montgomery, Minnesota, which is around Faribault, Mankato, New Prague, kind of down in the southern part of the state. And when I was in high school, we moved to Chaska when my father took a job as chief of staff to then Governor Wendell Anderson. So we moved to Chaska, and actually I lived in Chaska for many years, raised our family there, and that's when I became chair of the school board out in Chaska for about 10 years, and during that time, that's where my construction experience came into play. We built 4 elementary schools, middle school and a high school while I was on the school board and chaired that. So I did actually get a lot of first-hand experience on construction projects, although obviously not nearly as large. So.
And you're not a stranger to projects that are sometimes somewhat controversial too, because when you were at the school board, weren't there some issues involving consolidating some schools too?
Well, whenever you build new schools, you have to redo all the schools' boundaries, and so that is probably the most controversial thing, moving people's children around neighborhood to neighborhood and going to new schools. So I had a lot of experience with having a good process to allow people to feel like they're heard, and even if in the end they aren't really thrilled with the final decisions, if they feel like the process was fair and open and transparent, it probably at least they felt like they were heard. And so that was probably my biggest experience with controversial projects of a sort. So.
And I understand from reading your background that you're a graduate of the College of St. Catherine in St. Paul, very fine private liberal arts school here.
That's
what did you
right.
study at St. Kate's?
Well, it was actually interesting because I got a degree in political science but also philosophy, and essentially it kind of taught me how to think. But then I went on to get my MBAs and really focused. I have a finance background. Then I went on to work at Ceridian Corporation, then Control Data Corporation, for a good number of years. That was led a business marketing and sales group at
Something
Control
called
Data
City
Corporation.
Venture, was it?
That's right. We did inner city renovation, a lot of small business incubators, a lot of development in cities that Control Data Ceridian was involved in.
Right. Now you come to your current position with really an extraordinary amount of experience working in state government. You were chief of staff to the Minnesota State Senate, and then subsequently were a top advisor to Governor Dayton. I believe you were deputy chief of staff for
That's
legislative
right.
affairs to Governor Dayton. And then one day in 2012, the governor calls you and says what?
It was really, people ask me, how did you ever plan this career. And I said, you know, you just have to be open to what's happening at the time. So I was in the governor's office, and at that time had been very involved in the Viking Stadium legislation, if you will, and putting it all together in kind of the financial package, and working with the Republican legislator who passed the program along with the governor. And they needed someone to chair the facility, and the governor said, well, we need somebody with a finance background, and we need somebody who's fairly independent and not really tied in with the sports world, and we need somebody who understands complex negotiations and who can really represent the state. And all of a sudden it was kind of like all eyes focused on me, and we were all sort of like, well, I guess this could work. So it's been a very, very interesting, challenging project, but I feel like all the things that the governor and the legislative leaders wanted to promote with the stadium have really happened. It was all about economic development, and when you look at the kind of economic impact that the stadium already has had, it's only 14% constructed, but already there's literally hundreds of millions of private investment that are going into that area. Wells Fargo building those 2 office towers, many residential developments that are already committed and taking place. It's amazing to see the impact.
We're going to talk more about that economic development too, and I can't resist asking you, Michelle, so you're 2 years on into this job. Are you still happy that you said yes to the governor and agreed to do this job?
Absolutely. It's been very interesting. And I also want to say there's a 5-member board, and I have 4 other board members that are very active as well. Mine is the chair. It's a full-time job for me. But I have 4 other board members that all play critical roles in the project as well. So it's definitely, and we obviously have a staff and many able people, and the Vikings are also our partners, and while they represent their interests and I represent the state's interests, they're putting in well over half the money now, and they clearly are playing a critical role in this as well. So it's been I think a good process, and I think it's going to be a very good financial deal for the state in the end. And
let's refresh our viewers' memory and my memory about some of the basics about this stadium. Stadium is targeted for completion in 2016 for the 2016 season.
2 years from now, July 2016. So in July, so the Vikings will play 2 seasons over at the University of Minnesota, over at TCF, and then in July of 2016 the building will open, and they'll play the 2016 season in August already.
The price tag we're looking at for this stadium, approximately $975 million, is that correct? Give or take a few million here and there?
Well, that's where it started, but it actually has gotten to be a little more expensive, and the Vikings have stepped up and put additional money. Of course, the state's contribution is capped. There's clearly no more public money going in, but the team is actually stepping up and putting in some private money. Some they've already committed to, and there'll be more announced here in the next month or 2 as we move forward. So it'll be probably over $1 billion when the final design is done and completed, but the state's contribution is capped, so it's the team that's putting in more money.
And I was going to ask you that too. So there isn't a scenario, because there have been some issues, and we're going to talk about pull tabs and some other things too, where there were some elements of the financing that did not pan out as legislators and citizens had hoped they would, but there has been this fallback that the Wilf brothers have put more money into it, or the team has put more money into it. So can you say categorically that the taxpayers in Minnesota and the legislature are not going to be asked to appropriate more money for the stadium?
Absolutely, I can say that. I mean, the governor and legislative leaders have been very clear that that's it. And so everything we're doing is operating under the assumption that we stay in budget, and anything additional that's done in the stadium, the team is actually stepping up and will be providing. The state will not be asked to put in any more money.
And as usual with projects of this magnitude, there was a legal challenge to you beginning construction, because there was a challenge arguing that the financing scheme for the stadium was unconstitutional. The Minnesota Supreme Court subsequently dismissed that lawsuit, but it did put you behind your start date by was it about a month or two before you could actually begin construction? So a little bit of extra cost from that slight delay?
Well, there was a delay in when our financing came through, but actually the construction was not delayed. You know, we're really fortunate. We have Mortensen Construction, which is a good Minnesota construction firm, and they were a good partner, and they said, you know what, we're going to assume that the state is good for this and the team is good for this, and they were moving ahead. And actually the way the project was set up, the team put in the first 50 million, so we were doing the early work with actually the team's
Their
money
money
came in
up front.
first.
Okay.
So while the financing was delayed, it was not delaying our construction at all.
And so it didn't raise the cost to Minnesota,
No.
the fact that it was slightly delayed while the legal issue was
Right.
resolved. What's the seating capacity of this new stadium?
Well, you know,
How
it's
many people are going to
interesting.
be able to fit in this place?
Yeah, it's the old, I always compare, the old Metrodome had 65,000 seats, and it was right around 975,000 square feet, so just under 1 million square feet with 65,000 seats. The new stadium is about 1.7 million square feet, so almost twice as large, with 65,000 seats. The same number of seats, but almost twice as large. And essentially what you have is, anyone who remembers the Metrodome remembers those tight corridors that the wind would blow you in and you'd
Yeah.
sort of try to walk through. Everything is big open spaces. You walk in and you see this open vision of the seating bowl, and there's just a lot more room, a lot more public space. And I always remind people, this stadium is owned and operated by the state, and the Vikings are tenants in this facility, and they play 10 games a year. And other than that, the other 350 days a year are essentially dates that the state has to operate. And that's where you have over 500 high school and college baseball games are played there, marching band competitions. Most people in Minnesota will experience the stadium through the state high school football championships, soccer championships for girls and boys, high school baseball games. Maybe they'll come to a monster truck game. But all these other events, whether it's the Final Four, the Super Bowl, concerts, or high school baseball, is all revenue that comes to the state. I mean, we are the operator of the stadium.
That's a really important point you bring out, because I think in much of the news media coverage of this, you know, it was so focused on just the Vikings as being
Right.
the only people in the stadium, and which caused some people concern. They heard Governor Dayton say repeatedly, this is going to be the people's stadium.
That's right.
And so 10 games of the year, I guess the Vikings have it, and you know, for a lot of people, they raise their eyebrows when they look at ticket prices to get in, plus parking, plus food and beverages. And for a family of four, it ends up being perhaps several $100s to be able to go to a game. And so the question is, how can it still be a people's stadium? And I think you may have just answered that. It's going to have, the stadium is going to be a venue for lots of other events and for the whole state of
Exactly.
Minnesota.
We'll still do rollerblading. As we went around the state to talk about what do people want to see in the stadium, probably the biggest group that came out to say we want to make sure we can still access the stadium all winter long, rollerblading through those corridors. But I always mention, you know, the team pays $10 million a year in rent. They pay almost 75% of our annual operating costs for those 10 days a year. And that allows us to subsidize the rollerbladers, the baseball games, the soccer games, and the football games, and the marching band competitions. And that's what makes it the People's Stadium.
Let me ask you if we could go back to the financing of the stadium for just a
Sure.
minute, because I'd kind of like to break this down by looking at costs, and then we're going to talk in some more detail about the benefits of the stadium.
Right.
But in the costs, certainly it's been disappointing. The legislature had authorized the sale of electronic pull tabs to help finance the stadium. We all know, I think, the revenues that came in for the pull tab sales have been very disappointing, very, very low. And actually, the State Office of Management and Budget reduced their projection about revenue. I read something on the order of 90% or better for 2013. Why do you think pull tabs failed to generate the revenue that they were expected to? And shouldn't we keep it in context, too, that this is a relatively small chunk of revenue in the overall scope of this project?
Right. Well, I think originally it was the legislature believed that the electronic pull tabs would obviously be a more significant source of revenue. But it became very apparent that while pull tabs itself has stayed strong and has actually really picked up and is producing more revenue, people really the electronic pull tabs never caught on. That's not how people want to play. So what the legislature did, which was really wise, is essentially a year and a half ago, so not this session, but the one before that, they very quickly realized that the electronic pull tabs were not going to work. And they passed another source of revenue to take care of paying off the bonds. And essentially,
cigarette inventory?
Well,
tax?
yeah, they did a one-time, when they did the new cigarette tax, what they said was, as we restamp all those cigarettes that are already on the market, that are out there, there's a restamping fee. It produced about $26 million. And they said, we're going to take that restamping fee, and that's a one-time source of money, and we're going to put it in a reserve, and that's going to be what we start with for the stadium. So they did that. And then secondly, on an ongoing basis, they essentially closed a corporate loophole. I can't tell you the details, but it was a corporate tax, a corporate loophole where they would, have money that would go overseas. They changed a law that closed that loophole, and they said that new revenue that had never been collected before now is going to go pay off the stadium bonds. So on an ongoing basis, that's what's paying off the bonds. So now any money that comes in from pull tabs just goes into the general fund. So we don't have to worry about that anymore. Whether pull tabs in general do well or not, it doesn't affect. Problem has been solved, and that was wise.
Because Minnesota has been fortunate enough and diligent enough to maintain a very good credit rating, even through very difficult economic times, as we all know from a few years ago. How are the bond sales going? The bonds have been sold?
Yeah,
and
the bonds were sold. It went out. It was a very, very successful bond sale. Everyone felt like it was really a success, and it was, and a lot of Minnesota people bought those bonds, so that's a good thing too.
Let's talk about the benefits of this new stadium. You mentioned a few about the ability of Minnesotans and high school teams to play on the field or have events there and other types of activities. How many jobs are directly being created by the stadium for both construction, and how many permanent jobs will there be at the new stadium once construction is complete?
Right. The construction jobs, like right now, there's about 375 workers on any given day on the job site. The projection that over the course of construction, which is about 3 years, that it will employ about 7,500 people in terms of actual workers on the site. What I think is really important is the fact that this is creating a lot of work for Minnesota companies. Over 80% of the work that's being done is being done by Minnesota companies in terms of the construction of the stadium. As I mentioned, you've got Mortensen, a local company. The good thing about having Mortensen as the construction firm, they have a whole network of Minnesota subcontractors that they work with. So when they put out bid packages, it has to be competitive. The prices have to be competitive. But they get a lot of Minnesota companies bidding on that work because they have this network of companies. So this is, the governor, the legislators have all been really clear. Governor Dayton has always said, this is about Minnesota jobs, this is about Minnesota companies, and it has had an amazing impact. And when you look at our unemployment rate of like 4%,
well below the national average.
Well below the national average. It's about all this construction work and this focus on Minnesota jobs that we have going right now. You go downtown, and we were talking about the cranes. Just on our site alone, there's 5 tower cranes, and now we have this big new
The big
crawler
one, yeah,
crane.
that was in the news the
People
other
should
day.
go look at it.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's called a crawler crane because it moves around on the site. It's 410 feet in the air when the boom is raised up. And the
If
reason
that
it,
were a building instead of a crane, that would make it one of the larger buildings in downtown Minneapolis too, wouldn't
well,
it? That's pretty
yes, I mean,
remarkable.
it's
It really is up there.
amazing. And you know, the top of the stadium is going to be, at that peak of the roof, is going to be about 300 feet high. And the reason they need that big crawler crane, which literally there's only a couple of them in the world, the reason they need that big crane is there's going to be a big steel truss that holds it up, and because it goes up to 300 feet, you need a crane
To get it
that's
up.
100 feet taller.
Let me ask you, you mentioned subcontractors that Mortensen is dealing. Mortensen is the primary contractor.
Right.
What about a role for small and minority-owned businesses in the construction of the stadium?
Right. A lot of small businesses involved, a lot of small Minnesota companies. There also is a targeted goal that essentially 20% of the contracts will go to women and minority businesses.
Is that going to
And
be achieved?
It's being achieved. In fact, they're ahead of that. It's slightly higher than that right now. So, you know, that's a really big thing. But again, it's about Minnesota workers and Minnesota companies foremost.
And of course, it seemed to be pretty welcome news that Minnesota won its bid for the Super Bowl that's going to come to the Twin Cities, to this new stadium in February of 2018. Is
That's
that
right.
correct?
That's right. You know, we're really looking at the stadium again from an economic development standpoint. It's about bringing people to the state and bringing those visitors here that will come and stay in our hotels,
Eat at our restaurants.
shop in our stores. So the Super Bowl is probably the largest, other than the Olympics, it's the largest sporting event. It brings in over 100,000 visitors to the state. It has a very, very large economic impact. You know, people argue, is it 200 million, 300 million, you know, what is it? It's hard to say until the event actually happens and you can go back and document what came in, but you know with 100,000 visitors it's going to be significant.
There was an interesting challenge that you all faced in coming up with the design for the stadium, as there were a lot of people here in Minnesota who wanted a retractable roof. But it seems that you came up with a little bit different solution that really is kind of quite interesting, and I think somewhat exciting too. The idea of basically, and correct me if I'm not explaining this correctly, I understand you're going to have a wall that basically opens up on the stadium that can let fresh air in when we're not suffering 20 below zero temperatures
That's
in
right.
January. But then even when it's closed, you're going to have this wonderful view of the skyline of downtown Minneapolis. And so rather than the retractable roof, we're going to have the retractable wall
Yeah, well, doors.
or doors.
Well, and two things. It's sort of Minnesota's version of a retractable roof. We've got 60% of the roof is going to be a material called ETFE. It's a chemical name for a compound, but it essentially is transparent. You can see in, you can see out, and then there'll be this wall of glass with 100-foot tall doors, 50 feet wide. There'll be 5 of them, and when those doors are open, it'll be like 300 feet of open air that comes in. And then along with that roof that you see the skyline, the sun, the clouds, maybe the snow, it's going to make you feel like you're sitting outside. It's going to be great.
I learned something a few years ago that I thought was really remarkable about the Mall of America. I never knew this, that they don't actually heat or air condition the Mall of America, that the ambient temperature in the building is maintained pretty much constantly. And so how do you maintain temperature in a stadium with this size volume of space? Do you have something like that at work here, or is there going to be a big heating bill for heating it in the winter?
I mean, we will heat and cool it, but it's actually, the cooling will be done through water. You know, it's a chiller and air that's circulated through the building.
So environmentally efficient, too.
Very efficient, yes. But it's, you know, this ETFE material has been used all over Europe in many soccer stadiums, in a lot of different places, 20, 30 years. So we know what it is, we know it works, we know what the costs will be, so we're not concerned about that.
One of the most exciting things for those of us who enjoy baseball too was when the new Target Field opened, to go into that stadium and realize there are pretty much no bad seats in the Target Field.
Right.
And of course what I'm referring to is big pillars or posts that obstruct your view of the playing field. Are there any bad seats in the new Viking Stadium, the new stadium that's being
There
built?
literally will not be bad seats, because the other thing, and this is a function of technology, we are going to have one of the largest end zone scoreboards on either side. So it's almost as large as Dallas has this big center hung scoreboard.
The new Cowboys Stadium?
The new Cowboys Stadium. So some people are familiar with that. We couldn't do that because we play baseball, and that obviously, that center hung scoreboard doesn't go so well with college and high school baseball games. But we're going to have very, very large end zone scoreboards, one of which is only about 10 feet smaller than what they have in Dallas. So even in those upper levels, you're going to be able to have not only great views of the field unobstructed, but you're going to have this technology that's going to make you feel like you're right there, no matter where you are.
How about accommodations for people with disabilities who may be going to a Vikings game or some other event in the new stadium?
Right. You know, that's been really important to us. We actually have a committee that was set up that is a disability and accessibility committee, because not only disabled people in general, but a lot of elderly people now want to have access to these stadiums and want to have seats that they can be comfortable in. So we've worked with a disability group that has come up with a lot of, and they did the same thing for the Twin Stadium over at Target Field. They have really helped us get great accommodation, so I think people will feel really comfortable there.
Good to hear. One last question, if I could. We have about a minute and a half to go. Want to ask you about the potential of this site as a potential soccer stadium. As we all know, we're just coming off the World Cup. Unfortunately, the United States didn't go all the way, but our team did very well, and it seemed like an unprecedented amount of public interest in the World Cup and how the U.S. team was doing. We have our own team here, Minnesota United. Is there a possibility that this stadium is adaptable also for soccer, the way there's a field in Seattle where CenturyLink Field in Seattle, home to the Seahawks, but also home to the Seattle Sounders soccer team? Are we going to be able to see soccer in this new stadium as well?
We certainly could, and I know conversations are taking place right now with MLS, Major League Soccer, and they play 17 home games. It's a big economic benefit to potentially get a soccer team as a tenant. And since the state already made this investment in this facility with that transparent roof and those doors that open, I think MLS is looking seriously at us as a potential site.
Michelle Kelm-Helgen, Chair of the Minnesota Sports Facilities Commission, thanks for coming on Access to Democracy today and talking about the stadium. And I must say, you must be putting in some long days, and will be to 2016. But thanks for being our guest today on Access to Democracy.
Thank you very much.